Good evening. Welcome to the regular monthly meeting of the Greenwich Board of Estimate and Taxation. Members, please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This evening, we'll be taking up the approval of the Community Development Block Grant budget for 2007. This is the third increment to the 5-year Consolidated Action Plan. As we know, this is a public meeting, and this month, due to the consideration of the CDBG budget, there will be a public hearing that we will begin shortly on the budget for 2007. There are copies, or there should be copies, of our meeting's agenda provided. Roland, do you have those? For those who want to follow along, also we have made in the 2 copies of the meeting's materials available. They're usually on the table in the rear. We have had the departure of our secretary in finance, so things may not be as orderly as they normally are, given her departure from the town. And Angie Marino, we wish her well as she retired to spend more time with her grandchild. So at this time, open the public hearing for the Community Development Block Grant budget for 2007, 709, and would invite anyone from the public to speak to the board on that budget. And also at this time, we recognize the Director of Community Development, Mrs. Nancy Brown.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to introduce Paul Settlemeyer, who is on the advisory committee. And as you may well know, 2 members of your board sit on the advisory committee also. I would simply like to urge the board to vote in favor of the recommendations as they are before you. If you have any questions, I'll be right here.
Great. Thank you, Mrs. Brown. And Mr. Settlemeyer, thank you for attending. I also want to thank Leslie Tarkington and Alma Rutgers, who served as the BET's representatives to this important committee, and know firsthand that there are quite a number of meetings that take place to evaluate the various requests for the funding, which is finite, and the decisions are often not easy ones. So on behalf of your colleagues, thank you both for your efforts, and we will keep the public hearing open till we get to item 7. I think that should be ample time in the agenda. And if anyone comes in who would like to speak to it, we would recognize them. We also will approve, once the public hearing closes, the appropriation of the funds in the resolution that accompanies it for further transmittal to the RTM. So at this time, I would call upon Ms. Rutgers for the reading of the routine applications.
ED1, the Board of Education, approval to use $43,863 in federal funding, which is a reimbursement for costs associated with educating students displaced by Hurricane Katrina. ED2, Board of Education, approval to use $3,999, which is a grant from the Kellogg Foundation. HD1, Health Department, approval to use $20,456 in grant money for public health, bioterrorism, emergency preparedness. PD3, Police Department, approval to use $9,562 from the State of Connecticut Department of Transportation, Division of Highway Safety. NW1, Nathaniel Witherell, a release of conditions on $3,870,163. And SS1, Social Services, release of conditions on $741,311, and I would move these routine applications.
Moved by Ms. Ruckers, is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Walko. I do want to acknowledge this evening that Nathaniel Witherell is represented by the chair, David Ormsby, and welcome, Mr. Ormsby. Appreciate your being here, and Bill Kowalski, the executive director, and Ray Augustine, the business manager. Thank all three of you for being here. Are there any questions pertaining to the routine applications? If not, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Carries 12-0. Thank you. Proceeding to item number 4, Human Resources Committee actions and report. I know we have received the healthcare budget status report, which we've agreed that would be sent in advance of our meeting and not be part of the agenda. Mrs. Tarkington, do you have a report at this time?
On the Human Resources?
Yes, please.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The Human Resources Committee met on September 14th. The first selectman, Jim Lash, attended and met with the committee members, Ms. Cass and Mr. Mynarski. Mr. Lash reviewed several informational reports, including the town's vacant position listing, new titles established in 2006, and reclassifications upgrades in 2006. The town's August part-time employee report was also considered. In addition, Ms. Cass presented a summary of the request for bid for the MC compensation study and outlined key input from the 3 submissions that had been received. The MC committee, composed of 6 MC employees, including Mr. Mynarski and Ms. Cass, plan to meet midweek to evaluate these proposals. The committee also discussed human resource budget guidelines, and discussions on the items will continue as prioritized monthly discussion topics for the remainder of the current fiscal year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Tarkington. Proceeding to item number 5, the assessor's report. Mr. Gwartney, welcome.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and board members. You've been given a copy of my report. It's hard to believe it. It's almost October 1st and time for another grand list to be completed, and we're working on that at this point so that we'll have a 2006 grand list ready to be published the first of the year. If there's any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
I just want to, I see item number 11 on your report is that you're working on your 2007-2008 budget. As you know from prior years, we have to approve. We received that budget prior to the submission to the Office of the First Selectman as the appointing authority, and I know that the liaisons work with you to review it prior to our receiving it. But also the operational plan is something that we'll be looking forward to reviewing, as well as the budget itself. So,
Right.
do you anticipate having that for us sometime in November or October?
Probably in October.
Okay. Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, I would just like to point out that one of the things that Mr. Gwartney told the liaisons was that increased number of accounts that will need to be established, the number of additional properties, and is actually there are approximately 400 new condominiums as of July, and we met with him earlier this month. He mentioned that that number has gone to 500, which means a lot of additional work for the department. So I just want to point out that there is sort of a changing kind of situation here in town, which is increasing the workload for the department.
Thank you. Are there further questions? Mr. Walko?
What is the status of the review of personal property? Do you have an update for us on that?
It is just about complete. I expect that I will have no problem presenting a full report at the next VET meeting. There's only, I think, 2 of the properties that are still to be finished, and I expect those within days.
Right. And that's for all of the money that was appropriated for this fiscal year?
Yes,
You're already completed with that?
yes.
Great, thanks.
There are no further questions. Is there a motion to accept the assessor's report?
I so move.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington. Second by Ms. Barton. All in favor? Aye. Thank you, Mr. Gortney. Mr. Shipman, thank you as well. Item number 6, BET committees and liaison reports. Begin with Mr. Stone. You have 2 reports, one from the Audit Committee and one from the committee looking to hire a new town treasurer.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Audit Committee met on Thursday, the 14th of September. First item we took up was the Marine Facilities Risk Exposure Report. Both the risk manager and our outside consultant concurred that from a liability standpoint, by and large, the marinas are in good shape. We did ask the risk manager to provide greater specificity on action to be taken, as well as addressing several possible safety-related issues that had been raised last spring and that had not been included in the report. But the report essentially has been released, and I urge you to look at it. Our committee is going to be passing it on to the first selectman, asking him to work with Parks and Rec, and requesting that by November a strategic plan be developed to address the issues included in the report. Second item was a review of the audit done of the medical file documentation, which essentially reflected a variety of errors in comparison with 2 outside vendors, Health Net and Anthem. Town records having discrepancies of 16% with the Health Net records, 21% with the Anthem records, and in sum, the amount of roughly $200,000 had been overpaid, most of which the internal auditor who developed the report approximates that 90% of it will be recovered from Anthem. He recommends in the report that a monthly reconciliation of records be done in the future to reduce the errors. Human Resources Department plans to reconcile the records by September 30th and provide full documentation to the Audit Committee and others by January 2007. That report similarly has been voted on for release. We then took up the action concerning payroll audit findings. The controller reported that he had heard from no one addressed in the audit or addressed by his in his subsequent memorandum. To the best of his and other attendees' knowledge, no corrective action suggested in the audit report has yet been taken. And just a point that in the basic report that was done last spring, there had been understandings reached with a number of the departments that by the end of September, corrective action would be taken. So we're certainly hoping that at least by the end of this month, action will have been started, if not yet fully taken. Finally, we reviewed the situation involving a recently awarded contract. This had been put on the agenda with the committee's concurrence. It was triggered by communications received from several private citizens who had been concerned with recent award to a contractor affiliated with another entity with which the town had had an unsatisfactory and fairly expensive experience. We reviewed the responses to several questions that had been asked of purchasing concerning processes involved. While on a preliminary basis it appears that prescribed procedures were followed, there was agreement among the committee members that this should again be on the agenda in October to determine, among other items, if existing practices and procedures provide sufficient protection to the town in situations of this type. That concludes the Audit Committee report. Connection with the Ad hoc Treasurers Committee, Treasurers Search Committee. That committee has met a number of times, most recently last Wednesday, with the following accomplishments. We agreed on a specific job description which principally provides greater specificity concerning those qualifications and characteristics that the new incumbent will possess. We agreed on the recruitment approaches that will be taken from posting to advertising to the process that will be followed subsequent to applications being received. At this point, 13 applications are in hand, and the closing date is set for the 22nd of this month. We anticipate beginning interviews in October. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. Are there any other committee or liaison reports? Mr. Walko.
I'd just like to report from the Budget Committee that most of you know, the guidelines were discussed at the monthly meeting of the Budget Committee. The full BET will take those guidelines up in October. Anybody who has comments relative to the guidelines, if you haven't already done so, to please direct them to the Budget Director, Roland Geiger.
Thank you. And I would like to just share with you the status of the Glenville School project. This morning there was a meeting of the Building Committee, and the architects are working with the committee on the schematics. They are currently at the 12th proposal. They've gone through 12 different designs, and the costs have been brought closer to budget. One of the things that was determined through the preliminary reviews of the building was that there was unanticipated asbestos abatement in the building that was not originally anticipated, and that certainly has impacted the cost of the overall project by at least $1 million from what was stated this morning at the meeting. So as of right now, we're looking at a project somewhere in the neighborhood of the high 18, close to the $19 million that is set forth in our budget. Are there any other reports? If not, proceeding to item number 7, the Controller's report. Mr. Medarski.
Mr. Chairman, this is item 7. Did you want to conclude the CDBG public hearing? Or
I thought we'd do so at the end of your report, since your report seems to take a long time. I figured that'll... Depending upon the members, it takes a long time.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. You have the Controller's report for September. Just want to follow up on a question Bob Stone asked me this afternoon in the personnel changes section. The internal auditor's position will be posted Friday, and the advertisement will begin Sunday. The meeting that I referred to when I spoke to Bob Stone was as to which newspapers would we be advertising. So that's back on schedule as far as the internal auditor's position. You all have a copy of the report. I'll answer any questions at this time.
On a positive note, I just want to point out, you noted it in your report, but I received a copy of a letter sent August 11th from the GFA, the Government Finance Officers Association. This is something that the town has annually received, but again, qualifies for the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting, and it's sent to you and as Controller and Finance Officer, but again, just want to commend you for the work that you and your department do in seeing to it that we attain or maintain that standard. So,
Yes, we do, and I believe we lead the nation. It's a national and Canadian award, and as I stated in the past, I commend the staff, Mary Welzakowski, Roland Geiger, and all the other people that go into putting together the comprehensive annual financial report, which meets all the requirements for formatting and reporting, and it's a prestigious award. And again, I accept your congratulations, and I commend the staff.
Mr. Stone?
Peter, I'm relieved that at least the search is about to begin. Again, you'd had an indication earlier today that that it hadn't even reached this stage. But do you have a sense as to what their projected closing date for requests for resumes is?
I believe it's 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
2 weeks
Okay.
from Friday, whatever date that may be.
Thank you.
Mr. Simon?
Could you just refresh my memory as to what happens after the public hearing on September 28th for the Millbrook sewer assessment, what the next steps are, if any?
After the September 28th town hall meeting, well, first of all, it might depend on what comes out of the meeting. There have been issues from a very small number of Millbrook people who wanted to change the assessment process. I don't know if I discussed it in this format in the past. They wanted to annually reassess all the properties, and the town is adamantly against doing that because that would require filing a map every year and reassessing all the properties every year and remailing every year and rebilling every year. So I believe, notwithstanding any changes coming out of the September 28th hearing, we simply go into the billing process.
Who sends out the bills? The assessor? The tax
Anthony Giovanone plays a large part in that, and he would team up with the assessor's department, tax billing.
But people from Millbrook are being assessed for sewer services starting in July of this year, of 2006?
It's I can't remember the exact date, but the interest has been accrued for the last 3 years.
Not so much the interest. What about property taxes for sewers?
It's as of January 1st of this year.
The January 1st?
Billing date is January 1st. There was a charter change to change it from the October 1st billing date.
Okay.
Just a add-on question in terms of the determination and the change to the annual reassessment of those properties. Is that something that the Condemnation Commission would have authority to do, or is that something that this board would be required to act on?
That issue came up. It was presented to the law department. In the issue, although I don't have the answer, may require a charter change.
Okay. Mr. Krummick?
In your report, I was pleased to see that there are negotiations going on between the First Selectman's Office and the North Miami Sewer Association. I just want to understand the process. There's negotiation going on concerning the charges, and then after negotiations, the Director of Public Works is going to certify. I'm being directed to put my mic on. Anyway, we're talking about negotiations over the final costs between the First Selectman's Office and the North Miami Sewer Association, which I'm pleased to see are ongoing and close to completion according to your report. The procedure is going to be then, after negotiations are concluded, that the Director of Public Works is going to certify to you the final cost, and then you in turn will certify those costs?
Yes, and forward them to the Condemnation Commission.
So your certification is more of a mathematical sort of exercise?
Exactly. In the past, Marcos, about a year and a half ago, had originally certified the cost at $13+ million. There was protest on behalf of the North Miami Sewer Association. There was a subsequent audit by a construction auditor, and since then, the First Selectman's Office and the association have been negotiating the terms. I'm not privy to what the figures are on either side. at the conclusion and when a number comes out of the Public Works Department, it'll be forwarded to me, and I will certify to the Condemnation Commission, and we'll start the process similar to how we did it with Millbrook.
Thank you. Although I was surprised to see Jenny come out of the closet back there.
That's a hard one to follow, but I did want to ask Peter a question about the section on outcome-based budgeting and the objectives for the operating budget. I see here that a section has been added which puts additional focus on certain departments, including the Department of Public Works, Department of Parks and Recreation, and the land use agencies. Are we going to do this consistently for all departments, or have we selected just a few departments?
They would be the initial departments. That was taken out of the context of the budget guidelines. Of course, yes, ultimately it would be all the departments in the town.
So when you mean ultimately, I mean, this year you're only targeting certain departments, or?
This is the start, the 3 departments referenced in the report. Immediately.
And when, say, you look at Public Works, which is the first department there, will these objectives and, operating statements, will they be by the individual divisions, or will they be for the whole department? I mean, how, since you put this in here, I guess you've opened yourselves for some questions.
The question being, would we break...
Will it be broken down so that each, say, division, again, beginning with Public Works, so there'll be objectives for, say, the Highway Department, objectives for the...
Of course. Take for example,
individual.
Parks and Recreation. The golf course would be separate from all the rest of Parks and Rec, and the Marina Division would be separate from all the rest. The answer to your question, yes, you would break it down by division.
Thank you.
One of the areas that we were going to have an ad hoc committee, and I had talked to Ms. Rutgers about it in terms of representation, is this subject in terms of working with the front office and your office. And it became apparent from the composition that essentially it's the budget committee that is going to be the committee working with you on behalf of the board to review this. And I just wanted to point that out. I know, Ms. Tarkington, initially you had volunteered, but it became evident that the budget committee was taking the lead on it, so therefore I've agreed that they should pursue it. Certainly the full board is going to be apprised of the developments, but they're going to be the group that...
Well, I understand that in terms of the budgets, but I also think this is creating personal objectives and so forth for the managers, and I think that needs to be linked in with the Human Resources Committee, so I'd like to just add that
Certainly.
comment.
If you certainly can work with them, and they'll share information. Information can be shared with the entire board, in particular that committee, the Human Resources Committee. There was another item. Do you have something that's on the report?
I do.
I'm sorry, and I've been...
That's all right.
Go ahead. Mr. Walcom.
It dovetails or connects to that last conversation. Peter, what do you mean by your last sentence of the report on page 4? The MC Committee will be meeting September 20th, 2006 to expand upon their role relative to the MC compensation and benefits.
There was an MC Committee, I believe, that was convened in 2002, and this is the same type of committee to address compensation and benefits for MC Management Confidential. We're meeting tomorrow afternoon at 2. The first part of the meeting is to look at the bids for a compensation benchmarking study, choose a vendor, and the purpose or the meaning of the sentence is to also define the roles of the MC Committee and expand upon the role beyond just simply reviewing the bid and forwarding the information to the BET.
Who is selecting the vendor? Who has the authority to select the vendor?
It would be the I believe it would be the MC Committee, correct? Is that right?
And the MC Committee...
We would actually select the committee, the vendor, correct? Yes.
The MC Committee is solely comprised of individuals in the MC grouping?
I believe...
Ladies?
There's Maureen Cass, there's Mario Gonzalez, Lloyd Hubbs, myself, I'm not sure if Ed's on the committee or is a liaison. There might be one or two others.
So I guess my concern is you're choosing a vendor to do a study about your compensation.
The committee is. It's already been bid out. There's 3 vendors out there. We're just going to analyze the bids as to the price and the scope of the services.
Ms. Tarkington, you had alluded to this in your report earlier, but I do think your committee wants to have, my understanding was your committee was going to have some input into this process.
We certainly hope so, Mr. Chairman. And
More than
and
hope,
Mr. Walker.
I think there was
And-
an expectation that you were going to have input into the process.
Absolutely, and I think Ms. Cass has, then since selected the committee, and I think she's used the memo from, I guess, written by the then chairman of the Budget Committee as the reason for the selection of being this particular group. But I think, we advised Ms. Cass in our last meeting where the First Selectman was also present, that we would like to give some input into the processes and some expectations of what we expect in that study, in addition to what was in the RFP, which was perhaps a little narrow in scope in terms of the overall expected outcome and the importance of the study.
So I think Mr. Walko has raised a valid point in terms of having some outside involvement and oversight to selecting a vendor for the study that will recommend compensation for the very people who would be on the committee. And I think what Mrs. Tarkington has indicated is that her committee has an expectation to be involved in that and to provide some balance and objectivity, therefore removing any appearance, because the appearance of conflict in terms of what the committee is charged to look at and the information they're receiving and not being diverse is not a good one, at least from my perspective. So if you can communicate that to Ms. Cass and maybe Ms. Tarkington, you can follow up on what your committee's intent was or is, that would be good.
Okay.
Mr. Crumick?
I'm afraid what we're seeing is the result of the BET's withdrawal from the oversight in the HR area. As some of you may recall, in the past, the MC compensation plan and various studies of compensation have been conducted with the active participation of the BET, including the selection of the vendor. Because, as we all know, studies seem to follow from the viewpoint of the people that select the vendor when you're dealing with consultants. And unfortunately, this board decided not to become actively involved and exercise its budgetary authority to the extent that it's allowed to in accordance to legal opinions. And we get this, which is a committee of MC employees hiring the vendor who are going to come back and recommend what the MC compensation plan should be without any meaningful oversight by the BET, and I would submit without any meaningful volunteer oversight, and that's what we are. We're a board of volunteers. But this is the consequence of the BET's acquiescence in withdrawal from being involved in this kind of HR oversight.
Ms. Tarkington?
I just, I think that comment was made without the appropriate knowledge behind it. The HR committee has actually had an active involvement with Ms. Cast and with this RFP, and substantial contact with Mr. Mynarski and communications with Mr. Mynarski and what will happen. It was a major discussion topic at our meeting, and in fact, when Ms. Cass went out for bids, unfortunately, on the 31st of July, she only received one bid. The HR committee did help her and give her guidance in terms of additional resources. Many conversations also were held with the town administrator, as well as Ms. Cast, and also some additional guidance in terms of the parameters of the study. So, yes, there is a committee for the selection, but we have had contact with the committee members, and we will continue to have active involvement, and I know Ms. Cass is familiar with that.
Great, thank you. And you understand the concern and the message to take back to the group.
Ed Gomo and I will be meeting with the mooring cast and the rest of the committee, and we will bring your concerns to Ms. Cast and the committee tomorrow at 2 o'clock.
Thank you. Mr. Gomo, you're raising your hand. Do you want
I want to point out that the last time the consultant was hired, he was hired by the then HR director Al Collins. The HR committee was not involved in that hire. There was a subsequent committee made up of a number of different people, some of which were from the PDP, but there were some other outside agencies that we really with Al, realized that that's not long term. The HR director did the hiring for that consultant at that time.
Well, thank you for your insight. I mean, that was then, and now this is now, and I think we have evolved, and there's a clear feeling that there should be a role, and the HR committee is appropriately exercising its role, and so I think we'll be okay in that area. On a
I'm sorry, is a member,
yes, Mr. Crummell.
is the HR committee represented on the committee, the MC committee?
I don't believe they're represented on the committee, but I would envision that the selection of a firm would be presented to the HR committee for consult. I mean, that it wouldn't just be an arbitrary decision of the MC committee.
Or a fait accompli?
Yeah.
Perhaps I can call Ms.
clarify-
Cass,
can you
Ms.
just
Cass
clarify
and
that?
talk with her tomorrow and see if it's possible for a committee member to observe the meetings, not necessarily as an active participant, but we'll have our own
Well,
discussion.
they're entitled to meet, I think, separate and distinct, but in terms of authorization to select a vendor to perform this review, it's evident that the board would like to see this body, through its HR committee, play an active role and provide some balance and objectivity. So,
Understood? Thank you.
on another note, there are, on occasions, we all receive inquiries on the part of concerned citizens about matters before town government, questions pertaining to the business of town affairs. I have received such inquiry from a very noted citizen, very involved citizen, Mr. Romeo, who had asked to speak this evening to the board, and I communicated with him last evening at the RTM that our process is that we don't open up the board to public hearings on every given subject, but that by all means present the concerns he has in writing to me, and I would see to it that we can get him an answer. And he did just that today. And the areas that Mr. Romeo has made inquiry about pertain to payments made by the town to settle personnel matters, and the concern being that where the funds are coming from to satisfy those payments, who approved them, and was the process followed. One is in the area of the Department of Parks and Rec, the other is in the area of information technology. I have forwarded those questions to you, Mr. Minarski. I just want to share for the record with the board so that they're privy as to what type of things that you do in addition to what you enumerate in your report, and that you're going to provide a response to us. And it appears from first blush at what you were able to find out that some of this requires further review, that you have to speak to other departments within the town, most particularly labor negotiation, law, and human resources. So to save you from having to articulate that, I
Okay, appreciate it.
tried to summarize it for the members. And when you do have your responses, you can share them with us, either through your controller's report or through a separate communication, and most particularly directly to Mr. Romeo, who we've talked today about.
I did receive the questions this afternoon. I had done extensive research on the first payout, the estate involving the Parks and Rec employee. The second payout took me by surprise this afternoon. I did start research on it, but it did create other questions. So I do have a couple more questions to be answered. I don't think it's necessary to wait until the Controller's report a month from now. I could be done in less than 2 weeks.
And I think the way that you handle these is you give a good perspective on, a point of departure, to give an overview, particularly for people who are not here in 2004, sitting on the board, so they can understand how it all evolved. And, since they're going to be receiving it, I could just envision someone sitting in a freshman's place saying, well, who was this person? How did it? What's the relevance? So you can do that in the context. That'd be great.
Okay.
And thank you. Mr. Crumick.
To Mr. Romeo's questions, touch on the overarching question of how the town handles settlement of claims and how settlement of claims are funded.
It does reference claims in terms of process. Why did it not go to the BET and RTM claims for approval?
That's exactly the question then, and this is a question that we have from time to time discussed as a board. And I know when I was on the law committee, we discussed it. How you identify what is a claim that has to go through the claim process, and whether there are other ways to handle claims, in particular HR-related claims, and whether you can use 100's money to pay claims when it hasn't been appropriated for that purpose and you haven't gone through the process. And that's an important issue that I know this board has grappled with, and I know we've discussed in the law committee. So if that is the nature of the question, I'm not surprised you're doing research on it, but I think it's a very important question for this board.
So we look forward to receiving your response. I'm sure Mr. Romeo is, and thank him for respecting our process and how we handle it, and look forward to, again, thank you for your effort. At this time, if there are no other questions of the Comptroller, may I have a motion to approve the Comptroller's report? Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Norton. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? At this time, it's now 7:50. We've had 45 minutes whereby the public hearing on the 2007 Community Development Block Grant budget has been open. I would certainly welcome any individual resident who is in the audience who wishes to speak on it to feel free to do so. There appears not to be anyone. So at this time, I would ask for a motion to close the public hearing.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Rutgers, seconded by Ms. Tarkington. All in favor?
Aye.
And we can proceed with the item that you've come for approval, which is the budget for 2007 for the CDBG, as well as the accompanying resolution. And for that purpose, I would call upon Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I move that we approve, accept, and use the Community Development Block Grant proposed budget and expenditure for the calendar year 2007 and the accompanying resolution.
It's been moved by Ms. Tarkington, seconded by Ms. Rutgers. Is there any discussion on that? Yes, Ms. Tarkington.
I don't know if this is appropriate, but there is a typo in the resolution.
By all means, please correct it, because rest assured, the RTM will, and we don't want to give them the satisfaction.
In the fourth line, the "it's" does not need an apostrophe.
Fourth line.
Fourth whereas, fourth line.
Great. Do any members have any comments? If not, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Both carry 12-0-0. And once again, Mrs. Brown, thank you, and you do a wonderful job. I just want to mention to you, at the Budget Committee meeting, there was discussions about outside entities, agencies, and so forth, and I volunteered your services to the Department of Social Services because I feel you have such a wealth of knowledge with it. So if they call upon you, you can blame me. I volunteered you.
Victoria and I have also had some
Great.
conversations, so thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Simon?
Okay, I should have asked this before. What does the plus minus mean after the amount?
We do not know what the entitlement will be at this point, and probably won't know until January or even after January. So we say plus minus, maybe more than the 925,000 and maybe less than 925,000.
Great. Thank you. Item number 8. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Settlemeyer, as well. Item number 8, acceptance of the Treasurer's Report showing investment portfolio activity for the period of July 1 through July 31st, 2006, and August 1st, 2006 through August 31st.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Walco, seconded by Mr. Norton. Discussion. Mr. Simon.
So when I read this, when I look at the risk fund, this says we haven't paid out any money from the risk fund as of August 31st, when we had a special meeting?
I don't believe the check for $465,000 has been cut, or if it has been cut, it's sitting somewhere in a lawyer's office. You're referring to the Peterson?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes,
I only say that since there was a rush to have a special meeting.
I remember the paperwork coming through. The cash, it hasn't cleared the account.
The due to due funds haven't been settled up yet as of the end of August, so it's cut late August. And it would be transferred from the general fund, or from risk to the general fund.
All right. Then the other comment I have is, you can see from this report, when you look at the risk fund, the rate of return we're getting on the STIF, which is like 5.22, 5.20. We're doing very well in terms of our overall interest rates, short-term interest rates, which are up maybe 2 or 0.3% from July. And I don't know how the rates are going through September. Are they stabilized?
STIF is a little under 5.5. I would say yes. They were steadily climbing for the longest time, and they're not climbing as quickly in the last month or so.
And if we're getting 5.5, that's very good.
And we're getting a little bit more on the TD and North Bank, which is the former Hudson United Bank.
We're getting more.
That doesn't show it because we put a lot of money in there late in the month. We're getting, I think, 5.75 for TD North Bank.
For what period of time?
It's daily. We're locked into that until they change it.
Are you, Mr. Simon, are you done?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Himes.
Just wanted to make an observation that might be of interest only to the Investment Advisory Committee, but 5 or 6 meetings ago, one of our members observed that the U.S. Trust fixed income portion of the OPEB account had a negative performance and compared it to the STIF rate, which at that time was considerably higher. If you look at the data now, the third page and year to date, you'll see that the U.S. Trust portion of OPEB, which is the bulk of that account, has actually substantially outperformed the STIF accounts. And I don't say that because I give a hoot about U.S. Trust, but because it illustrates something that I think is really a limitation of the data we're seeing here. At any given point in time, performance data will do what it does. It'll be volatile, and it doesn't do what we really need to do, which is to ask the big questions around whether, particularly in the OPEB account, we're, for example, matching the duration of the assets to the duration of the liabilities, or for any of these accounts, whether we're optimizing the relationship between risk and return. So I just wanted to make that observation because we get an awful lot of information here, which is important to our oversight, but very limited in ultimately what it tells us about the health of these accounts.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or questions on the treasurer's report for both months? If not, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Did someone move it?
Yeah, Mr. Walco and Mr. Norton. Item number 9, approval of minutes for the regular meeting, July 17th.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Walco. Is there a second? Seconded by Ms. Barton. All in favor?
Aye.
Then for the special meeting held on August 15th, motion to moved by Mr. Norton,
Second.
seconded by Mr. Walco. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Abstain.
Mr. Krummick, Mr. Himes, Mr. Simon. Number 10, Officers' Report. I have a couple of items. The first is there was a request by the Board of Education's Director of Human Resources to appoint 2 observers to the LIUNA negotiations. This is for instructional and security aids negotiation. And I have asked Ms. Barton and Mr. Norton to be the observers on behalf of the BET. Mr. Norton is currently serving as GOSA, one of the GOSA reps with Mr. Simon, and Ms. Barton is graciously volunteered to take on this as an additional assignment. So appreciate that on both your parts. Mr. Minarski had mentioned earlier, we are in the process of looking to fill the vacancy created by the departure of Angie Marino. I think it will become relatively clear to members of the board over the coming months that without having someone in that position, it will make our jobs a little bit more difficult. We are fortunate to have the services of Val Zimbrowski, who has done a tremendous job of filling in with the vacancy, and I want to thank you for doing that because it's above and beyond what your duties are for the board in terms of the minutes. But it is important that we proceed to fill that and have someone here full-time to address the various administrative items that the board requires in order to operate effectively and efficiently. And finally, Mr. Walco, the chair of the Budget Committee, has already commented on this, but I just want to reiterate his comments in terms of the budget guidelines. They are the foundation of what our board's mission is in terms of setting an overall level of spending for the town. Your comments to his committee should be forthcoming. I know a number of you have already made an effort in doing so. And also, the CIP process began on September 13th. Mr. Lash held a hearing in this room, and that portion of the budget development is underway. So again, now's the time to begin paying attention and listening and attending these meetings, because this is the beginning of the budget process for 07 and 08. Mr. Simon?
Do you know when the next scheduled CIP public hearing is, or the process? Okay.
And that is all I have. Mr. Stone, do you have anything?
Thank you.
And Ms. Rutgers? Okay, there's no old business. Mr. Lash.
So quick. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to report to you on a couple of items that I indicated I would get back to you on, seeing that there have been developments. One was the $690,000 that is in this year's budget because it was carried forward from last year to develop parking structure at Benedict Place. As most of you know, if you stayed till 1 o'clock this morning, the RTM voted last night, was it 101 to 39 in favor of the District 1 Dr. Carlson resolution. That resolution set in effect that
I should not spend that money even though I have the right to do so. And I had indicated to you that I would spend up to $150,000 of it to put the plan through the municipal improvement process at Planning and Zoning. What I had indicated to the committees of the RTM in the work sessions running up to the RTM meeting was that if there was no decisive vote, I would probably continue the project. As some of you know, the RTM Transportation Committee voted 5-5. That would be an example of not a decisive vote. Other committees voted in favor and other committees voted against. You couldn't tell from the committee votes where that might be going. But when the full RTM met and voted last night, there was a lot of discussion, people expressing very different views about parking in the downtown area, and having, if they were going to vote against or for the resolution and against parking, having a wide range of issues. So the bottom line was they voted by a substantial margin not to, that I should not spend that money, and therefore I don't intend to. Now, there was some loose talk on the part of a gentleman who left the room here a few minutes ago, implying that we'd already spent the money and were sort of defrauding the RTM, and I tend to take offense at that kind of conversation, and I think a search of the records will discover that we had not spent the money, and I presume he'll be apologizing to me for that remark on his radio show soon. But if that expectation isn't realized, I'll learn to live with the complaint. In any case, that project, in my view, unless you tell me I'm wrong, will be stopped at this point. My view is that it's important to get the RTM to vote on projects, and this is a subject that has been discussed at great length. You and the RTM have appropriated money for the Desmond study in 2002 and the more recent study in 2004-05 and the $690,000 to move ahead. And in having brought it to that point, I had hoped we would be able to have a concrete proposal that we could show to the RTM, and we didn't get to that point because they've in effect, although they don't have the power to, we've allowed them to cut off that activity. I spoke to one of the persons who was behind that motion and said to them, you know, you voted for a parking structure just recently. And that person said, no, we didn't. And I said, yes, there's a large parking structure being built at police headquarters. Oh, but that doesn't look like a parking structure. And so I think that makes the point that it's important for them to see real projects and not just have fear-mongering, which is what you get sometimes. But I think there's an important policy question about the future of the downtown area and whether or not there will be more parking, and time will tell how that plays out. We have the POCD process underway now, and that will certainly talk about parking. And we have the other ongoing project, the master plan for the downtown business district that looks at Greenwich Avenue and at the parks. And we hope that we will hear in the next few days from the Board of Education about whether they intend to stay in the Havemeyer building or move out, and that will also help us with that. So you'll be hearing more about this, but that's the update on that. Yes?
Question on that downtown study.
Mm-hmm.
When do you think that will be completed, and will you share a copy with the BET relative to that study?
Well, I'll be happy. First off, there's a fairly sizable committee. It met the other morning in the Mazza room, so you're always welcome to attend those meetings. The public comes in small numbers, so, you know, if you want to participate in the meetings, that's fine. There was a fairly lengthy presentation yesterday morning by Gisolfi, who was the consultant that was hired to work on that. There are two studies, actually. There's the Greenwich Avenue study and sort of the Greenway study,
right,
and they're being treated as one by the committee. And the committee has a number of RTM members on it, so the RTM is engaged in that process as well as others. I think they'll be done with that in a few months. I don't think it's going to be a long time. I think it will. If there are recommendations that require funding, I think we'll find them in the CIP this year. But probably the final written report is still a couple of months off. Not because we couldn't do it faster, but because we, in fact, want a fair amount of engagement in the process so that when it comes time for you and the RTM to vote on it, we will have something which has been worked out and negotiated and should be acceptable to all the parties. Another question about that? I want to report on one other thing.
I'm done.
Are you going to let the 690 lapse?
As opposed to,
Not letting it lapse until June. The $690,000 for the garage, you can now say to finance, we're not going to spend this, and then it'll go back into capital reserve.
I guess I hadn't thought about it. I'm not sure it has a practical impact, does it?
It's, from my point of view, it's better that it lapse
Well, it will lapse.
before, sooner than later. I mean, it does affect how much we borrow in our whole cash flow financing.
We'll let Mr. Geiger to answer that. I think that's,
Let's go back to the parking fund. That was appropriate.
The 690 came from the parking fund?
Sure.
Oh.
Okay. Well, that's why I was just wondering. That's okay.
Mr. Kremick, do you have a question on the first topic?
Yes, I didn't stay up to see the RTM meeting last night. I was watching.
Well, you
Monday.
couldn't see it on television. It turned
Oh,
out
good,
there was a
'cause
technical problem.
I was watching Monday Night Football, so
But
I
it will
wouldn't
be
have seen it
replayed.
anyway. I will not watch the replay, but I assume that some of the people that argued against this, it was with anticipation of the studies that are being done, as opposed to, I know there are different views.
That's right.
There were different reasons trotted out for opposing this. There was the adamant, we don't want any parking structure ever. in
Illustrated
downtown
by the
Greenwich.
motion to not pass the funding to maintain the parking structure next to us so that it would fall down.
That's pretty extreme. But most people, I would imagine, that voted against it did so with the idea that it should be part of the master plan. And I would urge you and the committee members, when they're looking and they're working on the master plan, to really consider what I believe is a very strong need for parking in central Greenwich.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think many of the people who voted against it just want more planning before they agree to something. And you're correct. All the studies that have been done, one of the members of the RTM quoted a study from '92, I think. But the studies that have been done in the last 6 or 7 years all show, as a professional parking person would calculate it, that there is a parking shortage downtown. But, you know, you have the anecdotal person who says, well, if I just drive around for a little while, I can find parking, or I never have any problem finding parking at all. And that carried the day the other night. So we'll see. But you're exactly right. Some of the people clearly just want to see what the other reports recommend. Okay. Second item, the status of the public safety complex projects. As you know, when we put the public safety complex project out to bid, that is to say the police building and its attached parking structure, we received one bid on time and one bid late. And so we were not allowed to look at the bid that was late. And the one bid on time was for several $1 million more than the amount that's been appropriated. We looked at the response we had from the two bidders, and we also talked to the people who had told us they were going to bid and did not bid, and concluded that the form of the RFP had caused them to be overly cautious about what they were bidding. And with only one bid in hand and above budget, we didn't really think we wanted to accept that anyway. So what we did at the recommendation of the outside project management firm and Mr. Manelli, who's the building maintenance supervisor, was we divided it into two bids, one for excavation of the site, and that dealt with a lot of the uncertainty and risk that people were concerned about because it dealt with the question of contamination and removal of the soil. And then another bid for the actual construction. The result of that was the low bid for the excavation work came in about $1.5 million to $1.8 million lower than the one bid we had, that portion of that bid. And then when we received the bids on the 14th, for the construction of the building and the parking structure itself, we had 7 bids this time, so it was quite competitive. And there was some range in the bids, but we had the low bid was 2 companies within a few $1,000s of each other. So what we're doing now is we're looking at those two bids to make sure that, in fact, they both fully understand what they're bidding on, that they haven't inadvertently left something out, that we've reviewed any exceptions they took to the RFP document, and then we plan to make an award shortly. So those two are very close to each other. I'm sure the low bidder expects it to be allocated to him, and it will be in the normal course once we're satisfied that, in fact, his bid is fully compliant. If we determine it's not for some reason, we have another bid within a few $1,000s, and we would go in that direction. So that's the combination of the two bids we now have, the excavation bid and the construction bid, are within the budget that we have, including all the contingencies. So unless we get some other surprise, I think we're comfortable that we're within budget and we can move forward on the project. The status of the work itself is that, as we know from watching television and reading the newspapers, the police parking lot has been closed, and the police officers are now, for the most part, parking behind Town Hall, and the fencing will be going up around that site. We've had complaints from local lawyers in the area that we had sort of taped off their favorite parking spaces the other day, but we weren't doing anything. And then they noticed that we were removing all the heads from the parking meters, and we were beginning to get ready to put up the fencing. So shortly, their complaint about not having parking will turn into a complaint about the construction noise, which is, I guess, is progress as these things go. So it's moving right along.
I would just like to be heard on that. The lawyers that I know have been commenting on how nice it is to have light and air coming in the building.
We'll try to keep it that way. So I think that project's fine at the moment. Obviously, there's lots of work to do, but at least we're within budget. It's a large item, and there had been some question about it, and I wanted to update you. I'd answer any question you have about it.
I just have a comment or a suggestion, and that is to talk to Frank Mazza, the chairman of both the Glenville and the Ham Ave building committees, relative to the issues that Ham Ave went through with rock excavation, as to make sure that we adequately protect ourselves on the contract side for rock that may or may not have been anticipated by the contractor. I think there's a lesson that can be learned there that we should make sure we've corrected.
Yeah, I hope that we learned that lesson when we put the RFP out. I know we had gone to school on that experience, so I'm hoping that's okay, but you never know till you actually get in there.
Mr. Norton?
Jim, will you talk about the demolition, where we are with that?
Well, the fencing is going up so we can protect the site. The barriers are going in, and once they're in place, we actually need a letter that verifies from each of the utilities that they are disconnected. We think they're disconnected, but we have to have paperwork. And when we have that paperwork, we can get the demolition permit, and we should be doing the demolition perhaps yet this week. That had been the plan, as you know. The lead town employee on this father passed away, and so he's back to work now, but we lost a little time there.
Do we have any of those letters in?
We didn't have any this morning, no, but we were pursuing them. So extracting a letter from a public utility, I'm sure, is a straightforward process.
Just don't pay your bill.
That would be, I think, your department, actually, that does that.
I don't think there are any more questions, but we want to thank you for keeping us apprised, and it sounds like you're making good progress.
Yeah, we're doing okay there. That's fine. Okay?
Well, again, thank you. Thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn? Moved by Mr. Finger, seconded by Mr. Norton. All in favor?
Aye.
8:16. Thank you.